Our next guest is a senior editor at Vulture and the host of Good One, a podcast about jokes. His book, comedy book, How Comedy Conquered Culture and the Magic That Makes It Work, is out now. Please welcome to the show, Jesse David Fox, everybody. Welcome to the show, Jesse.
Oh, thank you for having me.
We have gotten to know each other very well over the years, but when I first came to see your name, I was on SNL, and you were writing a lot about SNL. And it was that weird thing of I was making things that you were commenting on, and sometimes I would be sensitive. I was just in general sensitive. But also I realized early on, like, you cared a lot about comedy, and you wrote about it from a very thoughtful perspective, which is why I think a lot of comedians to this day enjoy talking to you. Do you feel like that has been the payoff with the way you've approached writing about it?
I think what is telling about that example is I feel like when you the first time when you realize you respect me is because when I did a ranking of the best sketches of the year, I put one of the ones you wrote first.
So I guess that's why I like you?
Yeah. And that has carried on over the last decade of interviews.
I like that I'm like, you wrote about it thoughtfully, and you're like, no, I just like something you did.
But you're like, he really gets it.
Yeah, that was there. There was one time I remember where you wrote that something I did was bad, and I'm like, I don't think you're smart. And then... That's very telling. You got me dead to rights. You also, I do think, I certainly like listening to you talk about process. You have a great podcast called Good One where you talk to comedians about how they develop jokes. Yeah. And then you and I actually working together on a sort of a documentary project where you talk to comedians about the way they approach their work. And have you always just liked listening to them talk about how they get from A to finished product?
Yeah, I remember listening to podcasts where they would kind of get close to it, but almost you're like, oh, we can't get into it. We're too scared to get into it. And I was like, tell us how you do it, because I think a lot of audience members just assume they just go up and just talk about their lives, that they're just riffing up there. And even with me doing this podcast for 7 years, where I explain how much work goes into it, I still think most audience members don't believe it.
Yeah.
They're like, well, when you go up, I'm sure they're like, he just thought of that story right now. And he's just telling us for the first time. And I'm like, they're artists. They're working really hard on this.
And it's weird because I think, unlike painters, say, who maybe at the end wants you to be amazed with how much time it took, comedians want to go on stage and make you believe we just came up with it. That we want, that we have to put a lot of work into making it seem natural.
Yeah, and I want to both allow the magic of that, but also like, it's like, I think of comedians like magicians and not wizards. So like, when you see a magician do a trick, it's nice to believe like, wow, that bird came out of nowhere. But it's also nice to be like, oh no, they put like 10 years to figure out how to make it seem like that bird came out of nowhere. And I find that interesting, and I hope the audience does.
Well, you wrote this book to kind of prove that you could dissect comedy, because a lot of people would say if you start taking apart what makes something funny, it then is boring and takes all the fun out of it.
It kills the frog, said E.B. White and Catherine White 100 years ago.
Yes. And yet you argue that there is something exciting and interesting about getting into the granular part of making comedy.
Yeah, there's a variety of theories in comedy that I don't particularly like. The one I like is called play theory. And it's basically like, we laugh for the same reasons gorillas and dogs or whatever laugh, which is like you're playing. And my thinking is, by continuing to talk about a joke, you're continuing the play of the joke itself. It's not just about like, oh, a joke is like on-off switch. It's more about like the state of being in a fun space with a comedian or whoever you like.
You talk about fearlessness in comedy, because that's an idea. I think a lot of people want to make it part of their brand.
Yes,
you come and see me, you will see a fearless comedian.
Yeah.
And yet you sort of make a distinction as to what is actually fearless compared to what is presented as.
Yeah, I think often fearless is used for comedians who like to go on stage and make fun of this group or that group, and as if that's a scary thing to do, or more realistically, that is what a scared person does. And I was writing about essentially vulnerability, and I think it's much more fearful to go on stage and talk about things that you're scared of. The examples I use in the book are, I talk about Maria Bamford, who talks about struggles with mental illness. I talk about Tig Notaro. After she was diagnosed with cancer, she went on stage talk about it. I talk about Margaret Cho. And, unlike, let's say, like being revealed to be a pervert or a sex criminal, you actually can lose work for being diagnosed with a mental illness. Like, people do hold that against you. So to go on stage and embrace it is a gift to the audience, and I wanted to celebrate that.
You also, In the same way, there is always a real discussion right now about how comedy is too sensitive.
Yeah.
And yet, you sort of applaud the idea of going on stage and being sensitive.
I mean, often people will be like, audiences are too sensitive, and what they really mean is, I am old and I don't like it.
Yeah.
And I get it. I am old and I also don't like it. But what is wrong with being sensitive? Like, you want an audience who's sensitive. You want an audience who cares about what you're saying. And you want the comedian to be sensitive because you want them to care what they're saying. Like, my ideal comedy show is an invested audience, an invested comedian. And that demands people be sensitive. If everyone's just like going through the motions, like, what's the point of doing it?
Well, and I certainly think, when I'm on stage, like, I like the idea that we feel as though we're friends.
Yeah.
And I don't want insensitive friends.
No.
I don't want to be like, oh, I love hanging out with them because they never give a what I feel.
Yeah.
And so, like, that agreement, and I mean, look, I think also if you lock into the idea of, like, we are going to be sensitive, then you can play with it. And then there are those moments of shock where you can diverge off, but it's craft as opposed to...
Yeah, if you're like those comedians, like, well, what I do with my friends is we bust chops or whatever. But even that demands them having some sensitivity, because otherwise, then you're not busting chops if they don't care about the thing you're making fun of. You need to be like, oh, I know he's sensitive about his hairline, let me make a joke about it. If he wasn't sensitive about it, then that joke wouldn't mean anything.
Right, exactly. You talk about a moment that's happening right now, and you've written a fair amount about it, which is crowd work clips. And again, there's been all these sort of, I don't know what you call it, just like moments in comedy where in a really good, smart way, I feel like comedians are using new social medias like TikTok and new trends like crowd work clips. And it's really, as you pointed out, it's really helpful to help market yourself.
Yes.
And people are selling a lot more tickets because of it. So I think that's fantastic. But what do you think about this moment? Do you think this is going to be a permanent moment of sort of how crowd work plays?
Knowing enough about the history of comedy, there are no permanent moments. I mean, like, the benefit of comedy is it's so cheap to produce that whatever the new technology is, comedians will do it. They'll flood to whatever it is. And then comedians are so desperate for attention that whatever is hot, they'll do that as well. But as soon as there's a comedian who does it poorly enough, then they're like, oh, I don't want to be associated with him. But, like, I'm of two minds. On one hand, it's always nice when people like comedy. People are coming out who have never come out before, and I've talked to comedians who do it, who say the audiences aren't as bad as people say. You can teach them what a good show is like. But then I'll talk to comedians who don't do it, and they're like, the audiences are terrible. They are constantly talking all the time. And
because there's this moment, and now audiences are like, oh, I watch TikTok things. They want me to just talk.
And the problem is, not only is it disruptive, but ultimately, the goal of a comedy show, or at least I think any live thing, is to be part of an audience. And if you're going, being like, my name is Jim, I'm an accountant. My name is Jim, I'm an accountant. I'm waiting for my time to say those two things, then you're not allowing yourself to become part of an audience. And that, I think, is a bummer, I guess you put it that way.
Are you ultimately optimistic about the future of comedy?
It depends on what day you catch it on. I know enough. You know, I had about 6 years ago, I was like, there's no new comedians. We figured it out, we've reached the end of comedy. And then I was like, well, I haven't been to a show in a while. I'll go to the show that's happening in Brooklyn. It had 50 comedians I've never heard of. It's called Las Culturistas, I Don't Think So, Honey, Live. I didn't know who any of these people were. And I went, and it was hosted by Matt Rogers and Bowen Yang.
Yep, they're incredible.
Incredible, they were not on SNL or guests on your show. And they did this thing that unveiled a new type of comedy, a new group of comedians I've never seen before. And I remember at that show being like, comedy will be fine. There will always be something like this that is new and exciting, and in 5 years will be, Emmy-nominated comedians.
Well, that's very happy to hear, because I will tell you, those guys, I just recently did their podcast, and I was sitting with them, and I was both like, oh, this is an era, so far beyond when I came up.
Yeah.
And yet I find it so accessible and lovely, and they make me feel comfortable being an audience of it. Yeah. And that really speaks to that idea of sensitivity as well. It's nice to be around comedians who care what you think.
Yeah, exactly.
And thanks so much for the book. It's wonderful. Always great to see you. This is a fascinating series of essays about comedy. Jesse David Fox. Comedy Book is out now. We'll be right back with music from Steven Sanders.